In this week's episode, I am exploring risk, both real and perceived risk. This is a follow-on discussion I want to have with you. If you have not listened to episode 271 when I interviewed Angie Morgan, one of the co-authors on Bet on You, How to Win with Risk, do that now. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 273 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for a discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. In this week's episode, I am exploring risk, both real and perceived risk. This is a follow-on discussion I want to have with you. If you have not listened to episode 271, when I interviewed Angie Morgan, one of the co-authors of Bet on You, How to Win with Risk, do that now. In late 2019, yes, before the pandemic, we held 3 sessions in the What's Next mastermind group around risk. This is a group within the Career Pivot community. We first spent time defining what risk means to each of us. We each view risk differently, but those who are the most risk-averse often are the ones who society leaves behind. Like Angie discussed in episode 271, this is not about taking wild risks without understanding the ramifications. It's about taking measured risk. And in this episode, I want to discuss real and perceived risks, as not everything we view as a risk is very risky. However, before we get to the episode, let's have a word from our sponsor, Career Pivot. The Career Pivot membership community continues to help the members who are participating in this project grow and thrive. This community where everyone is there to help everyone else out to figure out what they want to do in the second half of life and then make it happen. Let's hear what Russ had to say about being part of the community.
At first, I got a lot out of the community, just meeting new people and finding folks in my phase of life. And that was really encouraging. As I've been in it a longer time, I'm now realizing that I have a community that knows me. And this is people who know me in a new way. And that is something that I've really come to realize that it's kind of, I don't really want to part with it because I do know that community and over the last several years that I've been part of it. It's valuable in terms of support. It's also valuable in terms of accountability. And I find that, I always get questions asked to me. I also learn things. For example, the idea of pivoting to do some online appearances is an idea that came out of a Career Pivot. We had an evening where we talked about how to do that. I'm over 60 and heading toward the middle of that decade. And I find that we are a unique group. Some of us, like me, don't ever have plans on retiring. We just want to find work that we love for the rest of our life. I find Career Pivot has people in there like that. And, it's kind of hard to know where to find that. They're also from all over the place, which I appreciate the diversity of experiences that people bring to the community.
I'm recruiting new members for the next group. If you are interested in learning more, please go to careerpivot.com/community. I will be intermixing solo episodes like this one over the next few months. They will be shorter and hopefully to the point. I am trying something different to mix things up. Now on to discussing risk. First, let's define what risk is. If I go to dictionary.com, there's a noun. When it's used as a noun, exposure to the chance of injury or loss, a hazard or dangerous chance It's not worth the risk. Verb used with an object. To expose to the chance of injury or loss. Hazard, to risk one's life. To venture upon. To take or run the chance of. To risk a fall in climbing. To risk a war. Now, for most of us, it's not that dangerous. But one of the things I want to talk about is there are 4 types of risk. Career risk, then there's financial risk, health risk, and even safety risk. So what I want to do is take you through a set of stories from my life where I took risks. Some of them I perceived as being real risky, and they weren't. And there are other risks I took that I didn't view as risky at all, but they were real risky. And the ramifications for taking that risk were pretty dramatic. And on top of that, how we view risk versus how our family views risk will be different. And then how do you take and mitigate that? So let's start out with career risk. Back in the late 1990s, I was working for IBM. I was very unhappy. I saw IBM taking some very bad strategic moves, which, by the way, I turned out to be right on pretty much all of them. And I decided it was time to move on. They had screwed me on my pension. They gave it back to me. I didn't trust them anymore. So I thought, okay, I'm going to leave IBM. I viewed this as being somewhat risky. In fact, in many ways, I've used it as very risky. My colleagues at IBM thought I was nuts. I was 8 years away from vesting in my retirement or fully vesting in my retirement. And I was nuts for doing this. Well, I found and interviewed for a job with a network processor startup that I kind of knew was in the process of acquisition, but I really didn't pay that much attention to it. They were in the process of being acquired by Lucent, and I didn't really know very much about Lucent other than that they were used to be part of the phone company. At the time, their stock was most widely held stock in the world, and I made the leap in January of 2000 to go work for Agira Inc., which was being acquired by Lucent. It was a network processor startup. I was going, wow, this is risky, but I'm going to go do it. And as it turned out, well, literally, I was going from IBM to, the sister of IBM. Fortunately, we were largely left alone. I was offered significant stock options. And anyone who knows the history of Lucent started in 2000 to completely implode. And I was watching my stock options, then the stock just going down. I also, at the same time, watched the stock market plummet. And little did I know, I financially mitigated a lot by pulling out all my money out of my pension, which they gave me a lump sum, pulled all my 401k money out. And at the time, I dumped it in a money market fund in an IRA. So as the stock market was collapsing, I wasn't touched. Now, that was my way of mitigating risk. At the time, I didn't do it intentionally. I did it so that because I was working so damn hard because I was working for the company founder. But I viewed this as being very risky. It wasn't. As it turned out, my stock options were worthless. I left several years later in 2003, and my options were worth about $1,000. They kept on issuing us new options, and they kept on going down, and they'd issue us new options at a new strike price, and the stock kept going down. By the way, the Lucent stock ended up at 1. I originally got my options at 64, and we were spun out as a Gear Systems. But it turned out this was the best thing I could have ever done. And in hindsight, it wasn't all that risky at all. I acquired well over $100,000 in retention bonuses, finished funding our son's college education, and paid off the house. Now, if I didn't take that risk and left IBM, well, if I'd stayed at IBM, probably in 2003, 2004, I've been laid off. The gentleman who took my job in marketing at IBM, put it bluntly, was better than I was. And he got laid off in 2004. So if I didn't take that risk, I would have been actually much worse off. And as it turned out, this set me up for all kinds of future success. And then the other piece is in July 11th of 2002, I went out on a bicycle ride with my Austin Cycling Association Bike Club. It was one of their regularly scheduled rides. My wife decided not to go with me because she looked at the route and said, wow, that's way too dangerous. And I'm going, well, it's just a club ride. What could be dangerous about it? And she just looked at me and went, oh, geez. But I went out. It was through a very windy area in Westlake, Texas, which is a town adjacent to Austin. I've written about this in the past. I, at one point, came to the top of a hill, came down the hill. I turned into a blind turn. Little did I know the road was cambered the wrong way, so I couldn't hold the turn, and I slammed into a 96 Toyota Corolla head on. Our combined speeds exceeded 50 miles an hour. Now, did I view this as risky? The answer was, heck no. Was it incredibly risky? You bet it was. Now, as it turns out, I spent 5 days in the Travis County Hospital, in their trauma center. I tore up a knee, I broke a hip, I dislocated a shoulder, broke a bunch of ribs, broke the clavicle, I had imprints of the pads of the helmet in my head. But I had no internal injuries, and I joked no brain injuries I'm willing to admit to. They had me walking on crutches in 3 days. They threw 3 titanium screws into my hip and had me up and walking. I was back on a bike in 10 weeks. I was flying back to China in 4 months. Oh, by the way, I flew into Guangdong province. I flew into Hong Kong, which I then went over into Guangdong province, into Shenzhen, which, by the way, at that time was the epicenter of SARS-V1. That's a classic example of where I went into an area, I passed through an area, and it seemed very safe. It was not safe. So my perception of the risk I was taking was I wasn't. Little did we know we did not know until March of the next year that there was the SARS outbreak. And I later found out that a bunch of people around me got very ill. So that was a risk I didn't know I was taking. And by the way, it's something I didn't really realize for multiple years what exactly had happened. So I left IBM. I didn't perceive it as being risky. I perceived it as being risky when it really wasn't. But then I go doing this bike hacks. I go on this bike ride, which I didn't perceive as being risky, but was the outcome was really bad. And as it turns out, in many ways, it turned out for the good. I spent the summer of 2002 with our son, who had just graduated from high school. We had all kinds of discussions that summer that I learned later, 4 years later, when he graduated, he actually listened. Which those of you who've had 18-year-old boys know that you can say all the things you want, they don't always listen. So here are all the risks I took But my perception and the actual possible bad stuff that could happen really varied a lot. If I had stayed at IBM, I was at far more risk, but I may have lost a job and I would have landed on my feet. But then let's talk about, safety risks. When we first said we were going to move to Mexico, we were going to drive down, I hired a driver to meet us in Laredo to drive us down, who knew had done this many times. He had driven many people down, particularly on their first trip. And my son and daughter-in-law both worked for the Navy. My daughter-in-law has a top secret security clearance, and my son has a secret security clearance. My son, or our son, buys weapon systems for the Navy, and we do not know what our daughter-in-law does. She told us she'd have to kill us if she told us. So when we said we were driving down, my son kept on sending me all these things from the State Department they were publishing and how dangerous it was. And then my daughter-in-law started reading me the Riot Act, saying, "You're crazy. You're driving through dangerous territory. We're not allowed to go down through." And I said, "Look, I'm hiring somebody." And she's going, "Give me the route." Well, I did. And she came back and went, "Oh, you're just fine." In other words, it's perceived as being risky, but I mitigated that risk. And this is an important thing we'll discuss later on in other sessions. There are other ways when you start looking at risk, and when you perceive something as being risky, how do you mitigate it? By the way, the one way you can do this is when you are about to go do something and you perceive it as risky. What's the worst thing that can happen? Now, I remember a number of years ago, and I'll plug it into the show notes, pro blogger Darren Rouse, who had a phenomenally good podcast, which he has since pod faded. He discussed this strategy of, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen? And he discussed the fact that he was holding his pro blogger conference in Melbourne, Australia, and he says, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? Well, weather could stop all his keynote speakers, who were mostly coming from Europe and the US, from ever arriving in Australia. Well, in his case, that was really bad because he'd have to refund everything. He would take a huge loss if he had to cancel the conference because people couldn't get there. So how could he mitigate that? Well, he said, wow, that was really bad. So let's look at how we can mitigate that. And he says, I can get replacement keynote speakers who are all from Australia, just in case, so I don't have to cancel the conference. I might have to refund a little bit more, back, but I don't have to cancel the conference. So one of the ways of always looking at things is, what's the worst thing that can happen? Now, like right now, if we look at the financial markets, things are going down. So how do I mitigate that? Well, I have a 60-40 portfolio, 60% in stocks, 40% in bonds. The bonds don't pay me squat, but I literally have 5 years of living expenses that I can live off the bonds. And I have 5 years for things to recover. So, okay, that's one way of mitigating it. So I don't, when things get bad, and I can't tell you the number of people I've known over the last several recessions who have done what I call the buy high, sell low strategy, which is to, when things start going down and hit rock bottom, I got to get out. No, you stay calm. I have found in my career, I have been willing to take reasonable risks, and I've not always, yes, I've been stupid at times. When I went on that bike ride, it was not a smart decision. And my wife knew better. What would have happened if I had not? Well, I might not have made several decisions in the future that actually propelled me forward. That bike accident was a life-changing experience. And I actually look at it as a good thing. So I want you to look back at your career and your life. What risks have you taken? How did you mitigate those risks? Were those risks real or were they perceived? In other words, did you feel you were taking this big risk and it really wasn't? Or did you take a risk like my bike accident and did it turn out okay, not so bad, but it was not necessarily, you didn't see the risk and the ramification. Because put it bluntly, my bike accident, I had at those speeds, you have about a 10% survival rate. That was not a very good risk I took. As it turned out okay, but take a moment and see how you have handled risk in your career and in your life. And with that, I'm going to finish this podcast episode. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Again, I'm going to be recording a number of these types of episodes over the next several months to try something different. But I really want you to reflect on how you have taken or not taken risks in your career and life. Taking risks is part of life. We take risks every day in our lives. Getting in a car, flying in a plane, and now walking into an indoor restaurant and being surrounded by lots of people. Have you taken risks and mitigated the outcomes? Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. You'll also find me on Twitter at Career Pivot. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-273. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. This podcast can be now found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.